It seems that everyone is seeking some sort of perfection in some sense or another. The perfect career, the perfect partner, the perfect lifestyle or circumstances, or even to become perfect ourselves. And of course, there's also a lot of judgment about imperfections, whether that's in regard to our circumstances or in regard to ourselves. And there tends to be a lot of frustration, dissatisfaction, and disappointment around all of these seeming imperfections. But what is perfection? What does it mean for something to be perfect? If you were to ask two different people to describe their idea of perfection, what the perfect life would be like, you would get two different answers. If you asked, what would the perfect partner be like, you would get two different answers. If you asked them to describe the perfect version of themselves, you would get two different answers. Now, there may be some similarities, there may be areas of crossover, but there's always going to be some differences in those perspectives as well, which is to say that there's no perfect standard for perfection. It's relative to each individual, which is to say that it's an idea, an interpretation, a mental construct that each of us carry. All of which suggests that apart from our personal perspective, that there is no perfection out there, that outside of our own minds, there's really no such thing as perfection. Now, there are some people who would say that everything is perfect just as it is, that everything is perfectly imperfect. And this is certainly a more positive way of looking at the world, but that's still an interpretation. It would be more accurate to say that everything is as it is, without interpreting it, without thinking in terms of good or bad, fortunate or unfortunate, perfect or imperfect, but just that everything is as it is. But when we have this idea in our minds of perfection, whatever that means to each of us, that we're striving toward, trying to find that in others, in our circumstances, in ourselves, it's often met with frustration and disappointment, which, if it becomes persistent, leads to anxiety and depression and hopelessness and all that sort of thing. Because as much as we strive to match that ideal or find that ideal or create that ideal of perfection, there's always some flaw, some imperfection. In fact, it would seem that one cannot have an idea of perfection without also having some idea of imperfection, that one can't exist without the other, because you have to have some comparison. How can you know if something is perfect without knowing what is imperfect? So can you even have this idea of perfection without also looking for imperfections? Now, something from my own personal experience, I've explored various art forms, drawing, music, painting, and so on. And something that I noticed in myself, and that a lot of other artists seem to relate to, is something that we came to call the curse of the artist, which is just an expression of perfectionism. For many artists, a work of art is never really complete because it's never perfect. When I would paint something and then step back, what I would tend to see is all the flaws, all of the imperfections. But often when someone else would look at it, what they would see is something of beauty. Most people didn't even notice the imperfections. When you took in the entire picture, those imperfections were so small and few in comparison to the overall image that they simply weren't noticeable to most other people. Or someone might be looking at it from the perspective of their own limited abilities, so what seemed like an imperfection to me seemed well done to someone whose own abilities were not quite as developed. So again, it's all a matter of perspective. But I recall many times when I would create something, a painting or a piece of music or what have you, and I would be very hesitant to share it because in my mind it just wasn't finished, or it needed some kind of improvement or whatever. In some regard, it just wasn't perfect. So I had to learn to come to a place of acceptance, a place where I just said, okay, this is good enough. It could be better, but it's good enough as is, because I could spend my entire life working on one piece, trying to perfect it, and never actually reaching that level of perfection, because the level or standard of perfection isn't even set. It can keep rising and getting further away, because as long as I'm striving for perfection, I'm always going to find some imperfection, some flaw, some mistake, or some area in need of improvement. So I had to come to a point of just saying, this is good enough as is, and then let it go. And I found that this also applies to life in general, to this need for everything to be perfect, that you have to just come to a point where you recognize it's never going to be perfect, perfection being relative, and to just let it go, to let it be, to see the beauty in it as it is, and to appreciate all that is beautiful about it without needing every detail to be ideal. But I think that also what is required in this is to let go of this idea of perfection, because it really is just an idea, and it's a vague idea. I mean, in our own personal perspective, it may look very specific, but as I said before, my interpretation of perfection is different than the next person. It's not a consistent idea. And even at a personal level, it can shift and evolve over time. So what I consider right now to be the ideal of perfection, that can change later on. It can take on a whole different image. So I think it's important to let go of this idea of perfection, to let go of the need for anything to be perfect, and to accept and embrace imperfection, or rather to simply see that everything simply is as it is. And if we can stop comparing our lives, our circumstances, ourselves to this imaginary ideal, I think we can do away with so much of the disappointment and frustration that we experience in life, to significantly reduce the amount of stress and anxiety and so on. And in place of that, we might find greater appreciation, satisfaction, peace of mind, and a greater overall sense of contentment. If you find this content valuable, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.